fall. The story goes on. The assumption was proved wrong, which existed earlier, and therefore now, because of gynocentric approach, people realized, the audience realized, that there are texts written by women. And therefore, there might have appeared a curiosity. If these are the texts written by women, how are they? How is their style of writing? How is the narrative? What is the content of the text? Let's read. And that happened and went some way towards redressing the balance of gender representation in literary studies. Although it is weighed heavily in men's favor. Of course, the texts written by men are more than texts written by women. But then, the very hypothesis that women never wrote up until this time is absolutely wrong. Women did write, and they did write in significant quantities. There were works written by women in Elizabethan age, and even before that, even during Chaucer's time, and even long before that. But then, nobody brought their names to light. And if we were to make a list or read out here a list of names that, that list that consists of names of women who have written works all the way back during medieval times, we would be shocked because we don't know their names, and we would wonder about, really? But then that's true. These names did exist, but we are able to know about them, fortunately, because of the efforts of a group of women who brought their names to light. All right, widening access to female texts and the emergence of a new politicized reading audience also succeeded in producing a wealth of women's writing, and the 70s were characterized by feminist engaged novels such as Erica Jong's Fear of Flying in 1973. So 1970s was the time when women came up with their own novels and they started publishing because they got to know that if we don't publish, we will perish. And therefore, just as our predecessors are unknown to the world, nobody will inform the world about us as well. Therefore, it's high time that we decide and face a society, confront the publishers and tell them that this is my work and you got to publish it as it is, and not reject it because it is written by me, a female, but rejected only if the content you find is not good enough, and on, of course, the logical grounds. So, in the 1970s, you find the feminist engaged novels coming into existence. First, Erica Jong's Fear of Flying in 1973, Marge Piercy's novel called One on the Edge of Time in 1976, and Madeline French wrote The Woman's Room in 1977. Now, these developments combined to create real and tangible achievements in the feminist campaign to raise the profile of women writers. Showalter re-exposed writers that had long been forgotten to thoughtful reassessment of their work and contributed to the new appetite for women's literature. So for the first time, the authorship grew, the ownership of the female texts grew, and the readership also did grow. However, the really innovative aspect of her work lay in her argument that women not only wrote different from men, but should also be, read differently from men. Like I said, I have talked about this even before, and I will explain that point all over again. That one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman because of their conditioning, because how the society, and we know how Louis Althusser has talked about in his essay Ideology and Ideological Apparatuses about the various apparatuses of society like law, education, medicine, religion, family, etc., marriage. And all these institutions of society, all these ideological apparatuses, have come up with a code called the Code of Decorum, the Code of Propriety, various codes, of course, but some of them are these codes, Code of Decorum, Propriety. And every code is about restricting a behavior of a woman to being feminine. And one realizes the extent of one's femininity only when one is restricted. You cannot laugh out loud. You can cry in public, but men are not allowed to do that. So you cannot get too much angry. You're not supposed to argue and counter argue and back answer. So all these statements. In a fit of anger, you cannot break a glass or push the table aside. So all of these points that need to be actually applied to both the genders, since why is being angry and breaking the tables allowed to men and not to women? But then it's wrong anyway for both the genders. But then restricting it or restricting these particular activities to one sect of society makes them rather more confined to a category, where the rules are set that you are allowed to do this and not this. So the do's and the don'ts list, which is not so visible, is already given out during the internalization conditioning period. And that, a person continues to imbibe and implement throughout the life. All right, so what Showalter says is that a person is, having a particular role, depending on their gender, has a particular role in society to play. Now, society dictates upon them to play this particular role in a particular way. And therefore, if you're a man, your writing will be colored by different, experiences and different, way, rather, let's say. It could be more egoistic. On the contrary, the writing of a woman will differ from that of a man because her experiences will be different. So the constant letter I that you see in D.H. Lawrence's novels will not be found perhaps in the novels of Jane Austen. So they differ because their experiences are different, because the gender roles in society are different. Now, keeping that into consideration, when you as a reader are reading these novels, you must also keep these things in point. Because being a critic is not just to make a list of flaws that exist in a novel, but to read it in such a way that you can appreciate a work for what it is, for what it stands, for what it portrays, for what it limns. Women's writing, Elaine Showalter argued, formed a subculture within the literary tradition, and it had its own characteristics, its own patterns, its own themes, and own distinct identity. To fully understand this, you need to first divide writings as male and female. And then you need to come up with a critical reading. If you are reading a book written by a woman, then you need to apply, you need to keep that in mind, that the experiences that she's talking about come from or are grounded in the reality that she has faced sometime in her life, or that she has seen others facing sometime in her life. Therefore, you need to be sensitivity to the motivations and expressions described in the text. And gender-specific analysis approach has to be kept in mind when you're reading the text written by men and women differently. You cannot apply traditional critical methods and assumptions, if you are to appreciate, female artistic expression, because then you will be trying to fit, as, Showalter says, you will be trying to force female artistic expression into an ill-fitting male mold. And the best example of this is Jane Austen. Jane Austen is blamed for writing romantic novels. Her novels, though grounded in social realism, are, called petty and trivial. They are not that petty and trivial. Look at Emma. Emma is an intelligent novel. It could be also turned into a detective novel. It could be given a different, its direction could be changed. And P.D. James, has been very intelligent in analyzing Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and she has turned that romantic, romantic work into something very different in her book Death to Pemberley. We could do that as well. Emma, if we appreciate critically applying this gender-specific analysis, we will see that there are conundrums in the novel and that help you to actually use your brain for that. But are we, conscious to that particular thing that exists in the text? Of course not. All we think about is that Emma is a romantic novel talking about relationships and female friendships and about one person called Emma Woodhouse who tries to, make matches for the others. But that's not true. Emma is a young girl and she's rich enough, and she has tried to, make a successful match between her governess and her best friend and, Mr. Weston. And that match is successful, and it turns into a happy marriage, and so she decides that she should now get married Mr. Elton. And therefore, she comes into contact with Harriet Smith, and she persuades, or rather, she tries to reinforce the false idea into Harriet's head that Mr. Elton likes her, which is not true, of course. Now, Harriet Smith is proposed by Robert Martin, a farmer, who is a respectable farmer. And Emma interferes, as always. She's rich enough and she has enough of the free time. And she's taken on the task of now matchmaking, since her first matchmaking has been a very successful attempt. So she decides to undertake this task of, getting Harriet Smith married to Mr. Elton. And she persuades Harriet Smith to reject Robert Martin. Now, Robert Martin proposes her through a letter, and she says, no, Mr. Elton loves you, and you have better future prospects with Mr. Elton. So Harriet Smith says no to Mr. Robert Martin. And that's what Harriet does. Harriet is an orphan girl, and therefore she thinks that Emma, being rich and her good friend, will only want her life to be happy and, good enough, prosperous. And why would anybody think negative or, ill about Harriet Smith? And she trusts her blindly and rejects Robert Martin in all her pride and decides to get married to Mr. Elton, whom she, in her head, thinks, and who Emma falsely has reinforced into Harriet's head that Mr. Elton loves Harriet. But that's not true. In reality, Mr. Elton has fallen for Emma herself, and when Emma realizes that, she realizes her mistake. Fortunately, in spite of, interference of Emma Woodhouse, the marriage takes place between Harriet Smith and Robert Martin. But not just that, Emma moves on to, make the match of Jane Fairfax and Mr. Dixon as well. And she herself, feels like she's falling for Mr. Frank Churchill. But what happens is Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax are previously secretly engaged, and when she realizes of that, she feels somewhat heartbroken. But then in the end, of course, Emma and Mr. Knightley get married to one another. And what we find from these little affairs is that though Emma is such a, shown to be a busybody, it is she who is controlling the house. It is she who is going to be the proprietor of the house. And it is Mr. Woodhouse has got two daughters. The elder one is already married to the brother of Mr. Knightley, and the younger is married to Mr. Knightley himself. What we need to know is that though this novel at the superficial level appears to be, a novel that deals with female friendships and one woman's interference, one girl's rather interference into the relationships of others, and ruining it all for, of course, Harriet Smith, but fortunately, she gets it back on track. But then that's not just that. Emma also portrays issues that are more important for women, that are associated with women. Now, we need to focus on certain things. That though Emma, which is a novel written by Jane Austen, is a story about the everyday life of Emma Woodhouse and her circle of family, friends, and acquaintances, the story also, is about not just village life, as they say, Highbury life. The village's name is Highbury, so it's not just talking about the rural life, idyllic life, bucolic life of Highbury, but it's also talking about the female issues, the women's issues, the thoughts, the fears of getting married at an early age or getting married at a late age. All of these issues are dealt with in this novel. The matchmaking itself is dealt in the novel. The story takes place, surprisingly, in the world, which is very cruel, of course, and the story takes place during the time when there are things going on, like important things, of course, like the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. And surprisingly, none of these happenings appear in the novel. So, on the surface, though it seems as just a story about the everyday life in the village of Highbury, it takes one look, beneath the surface at the history of writing and writers. In this case, Jane Austen. One would see that she's trying to do much more than write a cute romantic story about Emma and her friends. In Emma, she addresses many issues, important issues that are crucial to women. And now we need to move on to the time, when Showalter let us move back. This was an example of, how and why and what happens, rather, let's say, when you look at a text written by a woman from the typical perspective, from the regular traditional perspective. Now, if you do gender-specific analysis for Emma, your criticism, your critical understanding will be very different from the other point of view. If you apply the traditional approach, your approach will be very different. You will be condescending not only Jane Austen, but also her work. Now, we don't want to get ourselves involved in the condescension of the others. Why? Because we must appreciate, as critics, the experiences of every gender that they have been through. Because though it is a fiction, the fiction is grounded in reality, that the incidents might be manipulated. But in spite of their, fictiveness, the most important point that lies is that they are grounded, anchored somewhere in the incidents that occur in reality. Now, it was a time, the 1970s, that Showalter argued for women novelists to be considered as, important, as women, and not as sexless aberrations from the male tradition. Showalter identified a common recurrence of theme and image in women's writing, and she decided that, if you do not pay attention to this common recurrence that occurs in the women's writings, you'll be committing a mistake. And therefore, we need to focus on a common recurrence of theme and image in women's writing that distinguished it unmistakably from men's writing. Phallocentric criticism focused on